Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of The Amateur Traveler is brought to you by Intrepid Travel, off the beaten path experiences to over 100 fascinating countries on all 7 continents. Visit intrepidtravel.com for more info.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 333. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about music and ancient temples and volcanoes as we go to the island of Java and the nation of Indonesia.
One more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have 3 news stories for you. In the first news story, which may affect the other 2, the U.S. Department of Transportation has determined that it is okay for pigs to fly. What they've really decided is that pot-bellied pigs or other pigs that are emotional support companions will be allowed on planes. And because pigs can fly, we had the following 2 stories. The first one, a little horrific for those of us who are parents. A baby was spotted in a baggage scanner because a 5-month-old infant, had been placed inside carry-on luggage to try and sneak them into the United Arab Emirates without a visa. I just can't imagine that someone thought that was a good idea. And then the second one, it got so hot recently on the East Coast of the United States that in Reagan National Airport just outside of Washington, D.C., there were flight delays because a plane stuck to the tarmac. And that explains why I don't live in Washington, D.C. For links to all 3 of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. As I mentioned in the pre-roll, this episode of The Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Intrepid Travel. Get off the beaten track with Intrepid Travel. Intrepid travelers discover real people and real cultures on over 1,000 different trips in 100 countries. Traveling in small groups averaging 10 people allows for complete cultural immersion, while local guides ensure authentic, safe experiences. Intrepid brings positive benefits to their host communities and is committed to traveling in a way that is respectful of local people and cultures. For more information and to request a free brochure, visit intrepidtravel.com. That's intrepidtravel.com. I'd like to welcome Lash from Lash World Tour, who's come to talk to us about Java. Lash, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Nice to be here.
And normally I introduce somebody as being from someplace or living someplace else, but you've been nomadic for the last number of years.
Yeah, that's right. I've been traveling around the world since 1998, mostly in Asia. Step out from time to time, but I'm usually over in Southeast Asia area.
And coming to us today from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So, Lash, you had proposed Java. First of all, I'm not sure that everybody knows where Java is. I think many people think it's a programming language. So can you put it on the map for us?
That's a good way to start, Chris. Yeah, Java is one of the major islands in the large nation of Indonesia, which comprises over 1,000 islands. But Java is one of the main islands. That's where the capital of the country is, Jakarta, and it's a very densely populated island. It's just west of Bali. Probably a lot of people know Bali, and it's Bali's neighbor to the west.
And you said the large country of Indonesia. I'm not sure that everybody realizes the scale of Indonesia. I think a lot of people think of it as a bunch of little islands, but it's really a very densely packed, very populous country for one thing.
Yeah, that's right. It's really huge. I can't tell you the figures in terms of the actual area that it covers, including the seas and all the water. But the major islands are Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi. On Borneo Island, two-thirds of the island of Borneo. Kalimantan is also Indonesia. Also half of Papua New Guinea and Spice Islands, where the original spice trade was going on. And it's at the south end of Southeast Asia, so it's wedged sort of between the peninsula of Malaysia, Singapore on the north, and Australia is south of Indonesia.
Excellent. And why should we go to Java?
Well, Java is a very, very interesting place, quite different from any Western country. It's predominantly Muslim. It's in the tropics. It's almost on the equator, if not, equator doesn't pass through it. It's very close to the equator. And it's mountainous. There are a lot of volcanoes. So probably the main two reasons to go to Java would be for culture. There's a lot of interesting cultural arts there, like the gamelan music, which is similar to Bali's gamelan music, but a little more sedate, and other arts like batik fabrics. And it was the seat of several Javanese empires, so there's remnants of that in some of the cities. So culture, and the other thing would be nature. Java's just a really beautiful island of rice fields, a lot of mountains and volcanoes, like I mentioned before. Probably the most famous volcanoes are Mount Bromo and Merapi, which is close to Jogja. That one erupted several years ago, and it's just north of one of Java's main cities. And then Krakatoa is just to the west of Java, between Java Island and Sumatra Island. But there are a lot of other volcanoes and mountains, and I did a lot of mountain and volcano hiking when I went there. So anyone who's into nature or culture, would be a great place to choose for a vacation.
And Krakatoa, as I recall, is such a big volcano that one of the last times it erupted a number of years ago, hundreds of years ago at this point, was the year without winter in England and Europe.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's thought to be one of the loudest sounds in terms of how loud it was. Now, you mentioned that it is a predominantly Muslim country, and we should say that actually it's the most populous Muslim country. It's not entirely Muslim, it's a little less than 90%. Many people go to Bali, which is not a typical Indonesian island in the sense that it's predominantly Hindu. So as you're going to Java, you're really going more to the heart of Indonesia. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They are quite different, Bali and Java. Bali and actually the rest of Indonesia are entirely different because of Balinese Hinduism, mainly. But yeah, you could, if you went to Indonesia, visit two entirely different cultures and have completely different experiences if you went to Java and Bali, for example.
And what kind of itinerary would you recommend for Java? Where would we come in? Where would we start? And what would we see while we're there?
Okay, well, I suppose you have two options. A lot of people are primarily going to Bali, so it's very easy from Bali to go over to eastern Java, say to Bromo volcano and some of the other volcanoes in the eastern end of the island. And that's a good way to go see it if you're mainly going to Bali and you just want to do a little side trip. Otherwise, the main entry point would be Jakarta, which is the capital of the country. And when you get over to Southeast Asia, there are a lot of flights that go into Jakarta from Malaysia, Singapore, Bangkok. All the main cities over here fly into Jakarta. So that's how you would get there. And what kind of itinerary? Well, see, because I'm a nomadic traveler and I'm traveling for a long time, I take my time whenever I go anywhere. So I spent 2 months going through the island when I went, and I went with my bicycle, so I did a lot of cycling and a lot of hiking. So it's probably a little hard for me to say how someone who's just going on a 1 week or 2 week vacation would visit Java. It depends on your interests and your time frame, I suppose. If you were on a really short vacation, maybe some highlights would be Mount Bromo volcano in the east. Oh, the two huge temples of Borobudur and Prambanan. Borobudur is one of the three main ancient temples in Southeast Asia, the other two being Angkor Wat in Cambodia and Bagan up in Myanmar. And Borobudur is just massive. I wish I could show you the picture of me standing on it. It's just a unbelievably huge, huge building.
Well, for many people, they're actually looking at pictures because they have a version of this show that does have pictures. So perhaps you are looking at that picture.
Excellent. Okay. So, want to know about someone who's coming for maybe 1 week, 2 weeks, a month?
Sure. Let's target that.
Okay. So, if you had 1 to 2 weeks in Java, you probably would not want to miss Borobudur Temple. Borobudur is fairly close to Yogyakarta, so you probably want to base yourself in, it's also called Jogja, but strangely enough spelled Y-O-G-Y, but pronounced Jogja. That's considered one of the cultural bases of Java, although when I went there, I wasn't that impressed. I was more impressed with the nearby city of Surakarta, also called Solo, which was another one of the ancient centers of one of the ancient Javanese sultanates. But anyhow, if you're basing yourself in Yogyakarta, then you can make a day trip up to Borobudur from Jogja, which you could easily arrange from a tour with your hotel or one of the tour agents in Jogja, or find a driver. Java's kind of suffering from lack of tourism for the last several years. Used to be a lot more popular place for people to go, and then I'm not sure why people stopped going to Java as much as Bali and just focusing on Bali. So even when I went there several years ago, all the people who used to work in the tourism business taking care of tourists, like guides, drivers, people trying to get you to shops to earn some commission, all those people were kind of out of work. So when you do go to Java, then it's very easy to find people who can help you because they're just dying to get any kind of work or interact with Westerners, practice their English. So you can easily find a tour, a driver, or a guide to take you up to Borobudur. Otherwise, you can also stay in the village that's surrounding Borobudur, and that's what I did. There are several guest houses and hotels and so on. So then you can just go to the temple entry and pay your ticket and go in. When I went, I arrived when they opened, and I stayed there until they closed because the temple was so fascinating. You're pretty much free to just walk around. It's a massive stone temple with all these carvings along the hallways.
And it's a single temple, or is it a temple complex like Angkor Wat that you were comparing it to?
Right. No, it's just one huge, massive temple. And it's been repaired. Can't remember the details of when that was, but they've fixed a lot of the parts that had started to crumble and so on. But you can walk down the hallways, and there are these massive, very intricately carved stone walls that are the size of a person, as tall as you are. The walls carved with pictures of dancers and gods and their courts and that sort of thing. And it's something like a pyramid in that it's slowly getting narrower and narrower as you go up. So you can walk up a series of staircases to the next level and then up to the next level. And at each level, you can walk the whole way around that level and then go up to the next level and look at the wall carvings. Then when you get on the very, very top, there are these huge stone, basically they look like bells made of stone blocks.
So these are the stupa?
Yes, that's right. I think that they are statues of Buddha inside them. And then there are also statues of Buddha that are not inside stupas, but they're just exposed. That's on the very top. And from up there, the views of the surrounding countryside are just phenomenal. And the Buddha statues themselves and the stupas, I suppose they're about twice as tall as I am. So that's about, 10 feet high, 10 to 15 feet high.
Did you get a guide as you were learning Borobudur? I'm going to ask you to say it again.
Borobudur.
Borobudur?
No, I'm pretty much an independent traveler. I like to just go on my own and take my time and investigate things. I'm a kind of traveler who, if I go to a museum, it's probably going to take me all day long to go through the museum because I like to really look at stuff and learn and read the displays. If it's artwork, I like to, look at the paintings and see how they did their techniques and all that kind of stuff.
Well, the reason I ask is some of these don't have a lot of displays or a lot of displays in English when I think of something like this. So,
right. I have to say, over the years, I do occasionally think, it might actually be really useful to have a guide here and explain these things. So, yeah, that's definitely a good option as well.
And I assume there are plenty of people there who offered you the chance to hire them as a guide.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Same as in Georgia.
Sure.
It would be very easy to find a guide or join a tour.
Cool. And we should say that this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site for obvious reasons.
Yes.
Excellent. Anything else we should cover with there before we move on?
Well, if you're based in Jogja, in the city, like I mentioned, it used to be considered the cultural heart of Java. So there are a lot of shops there selling souvenirs and also less souvenir-y, more authentic arts, batik, and puppets. Java's famous for puppets and gamelan and those sorts of things. So personally, I found it all too souvenir-y and less authentic because I had gone to some other towns in Java first. But most people seem to really like Jogja. It's a little bit more geared towards tourists than other places in Java, so you can find some little cafes and restaurants and things like that. So it might be worth a couple of days in Jogja City. And also that would be a good place to buy things if you wanted to get some presents or souvenirs for people.
And in contrast, you were mentioning other places too. You were out on your bike across the countryside for long periods of time. How would some of the small villages that we would have never heard of out in the countryside that don't get the tourists, how would they differ?
For one thing, you've got the difference that you find in all countries between people who live in cities and people who are in more rural areas. They just have a different mindset, regardless of what country you're in, and just more geared to simple everyday life overall. Mostly it's agricultural, rice fields, and there's some stone mining, granite and marble, I think, going on in eastern and central Java. So those are the kind of professions they're in. People don't speak English. So when I went through, I pretty much just learned a bit of basic Indonesian or just used gestures to communicate with people. I mean, it's pretty easy to get someone to understand if you want to eat or use a toilet or find a hotel. They'll understand the word hotel, basic things like that.
And would you find your Howard Johnsons out there in the rice paddies of Indonesia?
Howard Johnsons. That's hilarious. No, one thing that we don't really have in the United States are budget travel accommodation. I mean, in Southeast Asia, just about every country, you can find places to stay for as little as $5 a night. And these aren't seedy, rundown, dangerous places that'll make you cringe. I mean, they're basic. They're not going to have air conditioning or hot showers, but you're in the tropics. You don't necessarily need hot water to shower. But they'll be basic but clean, safe, decent place to stay for the night. And then that ranges all the way up to luxury 5-star resorts. So when you're getting into local areas of Java or anywhere else, you're pretty much always going to find some sort of inexpensive guest house, or in Indonesia, they're often called losmen, and guest house, homestay, something like that. If you're in a really rural area, then probably there are places that mostly local Indonesians are going to be staying. So you'll be staying in places with locals rather than with tourists.
And what kind of price range from out in the countryside to some fancy place in Jakarta?
Anywhere from, say, $5.
Okay.
Indonesian rupiah, right now it's at 9,400 rupiah to $1. So 94,000 rupiah would be $10. And you can pretty easily find guest houses or homestays in Java for maybe 50,000 rupiah, which would be $5-6 US. And then, of course, I mean, all of the countries in Asia, you can go all the way up to 5+ star resorts. So the Four Seasons or some specialty boutique hotels can cost several $100s a night.
So $500 to $500 is kind of the range.
Yes.
Okay.
Pretty much you want to spend.
Yeah, and then I interrupted. You were moving on.
There's one other temple that's not as well known near Jogja, which was also very cool. It's a smaller temple. It's called Prambanan. And you can also get there as a day trip from Jogja. It's kind of situated halfway between Jogja and Solo, which is the other cultural city I mentioned, Surakarta, also called Solo. It's a smaller temple. It's also an ancient Hindu temple. And once you get to Java, you'll probably hear about it because it's famous for the dances that they put on most nights there.
Okay. And you say it's also now, the first temple we were talking about was Buddhist.
Yes.
Okay. And those looked like two very different places to me. That one looked more like a temple complex.
Yeah, it has one main temple and a few smaller temples. And when I went there, that one was undergoing really extensive renovations. So they get professional archaeologists and renovators to come in and fix them so that they're not damaged in the process. So it's a pretty long, complicated, and tedious process to renovate those ancient stone temples. But that was also pretty interesting because they had some displays about the whole renovation process and how they did it.
Well, and I was seeing some pictures. I mean, when we say renovated, it looks like basically when they discovered it or rediscovered it would be more accurate. In the 1800s, it was only half the height it is now. So it really had been half destroyed. So,
okay, that I didn't know. Good investigation.
Excellent. And where to next?
Oh, there's also, if you're at Jogja, one of Java's most famous mountains is just north of there too, called Mount Merapi. And that one was pretty active when I went through, and they had warnings to not go and climb it. So, of course, when I'm traveling, I always meet other travelers. And I met a German guy who was also into hiking and stuff, so we wanted to go hike up the mountain. He was a little braver than I was, and he went and did the whole hike anyhow, even though I was on the verge of exploding. And I just went kind of up to the base of the mountain and looked around a bit. But about 1 or 2 years after I was there, it did actually explode and spewed ash and lava down the mountain and buried a few villages and people who sort of refused to evacuate. So if that volcano is not actually erupting when people go to Java, that could be an interesting place to go and hike as well. So Jogja, basically a good place to base yourself in Java if you're interested in seeing those things because they're all right there and you could easily spend a week there and not get bored and have lots to do. To Borobudur, Prambanan Temple, to Merapi, and then just east of Jogja is the city I mentioned before, Surakarta, also called Solo. And that one, personally, I found to be much more authentic in terms of culture. The royal family, the Sultan, and his family still live there. So there's the palace, and there are a lot of old royal buildings and section of the old city that are still there and still intact. And another thing I really liked about Solo are the batik fabrics. The prints there are from the old sultanate, the Solo Sultanate. They had their own special royal batik patterns, and they're still producing those, and I just really like them. They're some of my favorite batik patterns that I found in Southeast Asia. So, yeah, they make a lot of really nice textiles and other arts there and stuff. So that's a nice city, too. Can I tell you a fun story?
Sure, absolutely.
When I was there, I was walking around looking at some art and so on, and some locals came up to me and told me the Sultan, who was in his 70s or 80s at the time, was about to have his annual birthday party, and they present the Dance of 12 Virgins, and that because I was a tourist, that I would be able to go and attend his birthday party. So, wow, great, okay, sign me up. What do I do? So they told me where to go. I'd have to be dressed by someone in the traditional clothing and makeup, and then escorted to the palace and be, taken in so that I could join this birthday party.
You didn't happen to notice if you were joining 11 other women as you were doing that one?
Thanks, Chris, but I don't think anyone would approach me as wanting to be one of the virgins in the dance. Maybe when I was much, much younger, but that's funny. So when people make offers to me, I almost always take them up on them without realizing that they might not actually mean it. So I went and showed up on the morning at the place I was told to go to get dressed up and put makeup on, and nobody was there. Finally, eventually, a couple people showed up, and I started asking them about it, and they were getting really nervous. But I stuck to my guns because, I mean, how often in life do you get a chance to go to a king's birthday party, right? Or see 12 virgins dancing? So I just stuck there and kept, waiting and insisting and asking questions. And finally, they bustled around, and finally someone came and they dressed me up and they put the makeup on me and they took me into this palace. And I was one of the few Westerners there. All of the other royal family members from other parts of Java and also from Bali had come to attend this King Sultan's birthday party. And we were treated to a buffet dinner, and then we sat and watched the dance of these 12 virgins. So these were young girls maybe they were aged 12 to 16-ish, something like that. Mm-hmm. And one thing that was really crazy is that the Sultan was sitting there. He was very old, in his 70s or 80s, and he already had, I don't want to give some inaccurate facts. I don't remember how many wives he had exactly, but it was something like, it was in the range of 30 to 100 wives he already had. And apparently when he watched the dance every year, he was allowed to select the next wife if he wanted to, and then have some more kids. So he was sitting there in his 70s or 80s with this very young wife sitting beside him who couldn't have been more than a teenager. So that was a bit odd.
And speaking of not getting facts wrong, I should confess that I got some facts wrong at the early part of the show. You had mentioned Krakatoa, and I had said two facts about it, that it was the loudest sound in modern history, thought to be that is correct, and that it caused the year without a summer. I think I may have said the year without a winter, which is not correct. But that actually was Mount Tambora, that when it erupted in 1816, caused such a cloud of ash to go up in the sky that Europe had no summer.
Wow. And where is that mountain?
That's also in Java. It's the other end of the island.
Wow, okay. So, right, if you just had 1 or 2 weeks to go to Java, then a good choice would be just to go into central Java to Jogja in Solo and visit Borobudur Temple, Prambanan Temple, perhaps volcanic Mount Merapi, and, the cultural centers in Solo and maybe Jogja. The other thing that people really enjoy doing in Java, one of the most famous and most popular things is the volcano Bromo, which is over in eastern Java. Mm-hmm. That is very similar to Mount Batur on Bali Island, because I don't know when, but hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, it exploded and it left a huge crater, which is maybe 10 kilometers across in the center. And so there's actually towns in there or little villages in there, and people actually do farming and live in there because the soil is very rich. And then the actual active cone of the volcano is inside that crater. So you have the huge main crater with the small volcanic cone inside of it sticking out of the middle of it. That's how Batur is in Bali. In Bali, in Mount Batur, actually are towns. There's a lake in there, Lake Batur, and there are several towns down in there and a lot of people doing farming. In the crater of Bromo, if I remember correctly, there aren't any towns or villages in there. It's a very desolate moonscape-looking environment, so it's pretty bizarre. But there are definitely locals in there farming, doing some sort of work, because when I was hiking through there, I came across a guy who was carrying huge bundles of grasses or some sort of crop.
Interesting.
Yeah, so anyhow, on the crater rim, which goes around this huge 6-mile wide diameter crater, up on the rim of the crater, there are towns up there. And so in those towns, there are some guest houses and hotels and things, and they're accustomed to having tourists come there. So it's kind of a tourist area. And so it's easy to find accommodation up on the rim of the volcano. And then you can hire a guide or a driver and take a jeep down into the crater and over to the cone, which is still bubbling mud and gas, and hike up onto the rim of that crater, which isn't very high, and look down into the bubbling mud pool and so on. Or you can also hike there, which is what I did. Just go on your own, hike down into the crater, across the floor of the crater to the mountain rim volcano.
Now, I see that there were eruptions there just last year, just in January of 2011. Were you there before that?
Yeah, I was actually in Java several years ago.
Okay. So that's something people might want to check on before you go. Is right now there's an exclusion zone because of some eruptions, and I don't know what the state is of that at this point. Okay.
Yeah, that's good to know. You definitely want to check on that.
And that's going to be true anytime we talk about any place with a volcano. It's always good to check.
Mm-hmm. Now, just next door to Bromo is Java's highest mountain, which is also volcanic, and it's called Mount Semeru. That's one that I hiked myself, and that's like a backpacking excursion. You have to pretty much be a good hiker, climber, have had some experience, take all the gear that you need with you, your filter, food, camping gear, everything you need. And it's basically a 3-day hike to go in there and then hike up to the top of Mount Semeru. And that's also an active volcano, which is mostly spewing gases, but the gases are toxic. So if you get a whiff of the gas, pretty much it's going to kill you. So,
oh, well, that always encourages me to go someplace.
So when you get there, I was surprised when I was there because I was doing a lot of hiking. I discovered that a lot of college students, Javanese college students, love to go hiking. So they have all these hiking clubs at their universities, and then they go out and they hike to all these different mountains and volcanoes and hiking places around the island. So at all of the mountains and volcanoes that I hiked in Java, I kept bumping into these groups of college students, and that was really fun because they were having a really good time, and they were very excited to meet a Western person who was out there hiking because that's not what most of the Western tourists do when they go to Java. So that was good fun.
Now, I noticed one place you didn't talk about was Jakarta itself.
Right.
It's a modern city, big city. It sounds like you're saying just get out of Jakarta.
Well, in my opinion, Jakarta is one of my least favorite cities in Southeast Asia, and that also makes it one of my least favorite cities in the world. There's not much there to do or to see. There are a few things I'll get into, but it's just so crowded, so dirty and run down, and just blah. I mean, if you really love big cities, you might like it, but otherwise, it's just sort of big, massive urban sprawl.
Okay.
I do actually love cities. I love cities that have beautiful architecture, have some natural spots like parks, have culture like museums and art galleries and nightlife. But Jakarta doesn't have too much of that. Although it does have really good nightlife. If you're into clubbing, they have some amazing clubs there.
Okay.
In terms of daytime activities, the only thing I really found to do there, and I was in the city for a week getting around by my bicycle, so I did see pretty much everything that's there. There aren't really many museums or art galleries. One thing that's there is the old port, and that was originally one of the major ports on the old Asian and the spice trading route. The British and the Dutch and the Portuguese all went through Jakarta and had a lot of bases there. At that time, it was called Batavia. There's a lot of history there from the colonial spice trade. There are a lot of great historical colonial buildings, and the port itself is massive. There are a lot of big cargo ships and things going through there. So if you're into ports and old colonial historical places, then the port in Jakarta is pretty interesting. But it's not all that extensive, like compared to a few other of the historical trading ports around Southeast Asia, like Penang, Malaysia, or Hoi An in Vietnam. The port in Jakarta for me, it occupied, I think, 1 or 2 days, whereas in other towns like that, I've been able to easily keep myself busy for 1 or 2 weeks. So,
okay.
To me, Jakarta is a place you would probably want to just pass through or maybe spend a couple of days to go see the port. It's also has huge traffic problems, so just getting from the airport into the city can take, it's not far. If there was no traffic, it would be less than an hour, but it can often take 2, 3, 4 hours, just like jammed in traffic.
What's going to surprise me when I go to Java?
If you have a chance to go through the countryside, it's just beautiful. Very green, stunning terraced rice fields, and it's just beautiful. Probably the population density. I wanted to check this before we had our interview, the population densities of the countries around the world and cities. But the population density there is unbelievable. You really feel a crush of humanity. That surprised me even. Before I started traveling, I lived in Japan for 6 years, and that's a pretty high population density. Right. And I got accustomed to it, and I was accustomed to that. But when I got to Jakarta, and then especially to Bogor, which I forgot to talk about Bogor yet, when I got to Bogor City, I thought, wow, this is what they mean when they say population density. It was just jammed. I couldn't believe it. Literally, the sidewalks were completely crammed with people all the time. And the streets, traffic's not that heavy, but people were just flowing into the streets because there wasn't enough space on the sidewalk. It was unbelievable. So that was very surprising. So I think probably you get a bit of a kind of culture shock when you go there because it's just so different from the Western world with the Muslim culture, the way people look, the sheer number of people, and the local food is really tasty. It's a bit spicy, but if you don't need to eat Western food, then there's a lot of really delicious food there.
When I was just looking up for population density, I live in California, which has 1/10 of the population of the U.S. in less than 1/10 of the space. So it's one of our densest states, and I mean that with the population, not with how they think. But Java is 12 times more dense.
Wow.
So it has, I was reading, 1,000 people per square kilometer. Okay.
As compared to what in California?
California would be about 1/12 of that.
Wow. 1,000 people, so 80 people per kilometer versus 1,000 people per square kilometer. Yeah, Java is very densely populated, but consider this. It's a really big island. Well, it's the size of Malaysia or the size of Thailand. Mm-hmm. Oh, I read it's half the size of England.
Okay.
You said the population density is 1,000 per square kilometer?
Right.
But
most of those are in Jakarta.
A huge portion of the country is rural, and it's not very populated because there are all those mountains, all those volcanoes, and all the rice fields and agricultural areas. So actually that 1,000 people per square kilometer, if that's the average, it's actually much higher than that because it's concentrated in the cities, in the main cities. Mm-hmm. So if you get into Jakarta or Bogor or Surabaya, if that figure you're giving me is the average for the whole island, when you get to those cities, it's actually much, much more crowded than that even.
Well, and that's not hard to picture. If you've been to California, for instance, we're similar where we've got big open fields in the middle and deserts and mountains and things, and then everybody in the cities. And so just picture LA with 12 times the amount of people, and that's probably a pretty good guess.
Yeah, so that's a good way to get a picture of what Jakarta would be like. And then on top of it being a completely different culture where people are Indonesian and eating different foods and, dressing and acting differently. That's pretty heavy impact for someone coming from, the United States, say.
Speaking of acting differently, any warnings you would give, especially cultural taboos or anything like that?
The Muslims are very modest people in terms of how they dress, especially for women.
Sure.
What I found in Southeast Asia, Muslim countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, they're not as strict as, say, the Middle Easterners in terms of how people dress and, following their religious practices and so on. And they certainly don't expect tourists or Westerners to follow their practices. So if you're going there, they would certainly probably appreciate it and feel more comfortable if you were, had long sleeves and long pants on, especially for women. But they definitely will not expect Western women to have their heads wrapped up, for instance. And if you're wearing short sleeves shirts and shorts even, or semi-short dresses and skirts,
it conveys a message you may not intend to convey.
Yeah, that could be. But they're not going to become aggressive towards you. They're not going to scoff or look down on you or anything. They just think, oh, those Westerners.
Okay. I would assume more conservative in the countryside.
Yeah, that's right. I tend to dress for the weather and kind of don't pay that much attention to what the particular culture is. If it's hot, I don't want to wear long sleeves. Sorry. And if it's cold, I'm going to get all bundled up. So I tend to wear just little, sleeveless T-shirts, and oftentimes I had my cycling shorts on, or hiking shorts, or short skirts. And in Java, I think only once had anyone a man grabbed me once in a very rural area. That was it for the whole 2 months that I was in Java. So that's okay. One thing in all the Asian countries, two things that are a little bit, that are not part of our culture. They consider the person's body, the head is the highest point on your body, and it's the most holy or sacred part of your body. And the feet are down at the bottom. So they're like the scum part of your body. And you also, when you walk around, your feet get dirty and all this. So that's kind of how they look at the body. So you should never really touch people on the head, because that's kind of disrespectful. And you should never point your feet at people.
So even in Indonesia, because I think of those rules for Thailand, but of course Thailand is very different religiously. Oh, interesting.
Right. Buddhist. It's the same in Japan. Oh, yeah. A tour guide pointed out to me recently at being astounded at having some Western people, when they're in a market and there's things set out on the ground on a cloth or something, fruits, vegetables or something, that sometimes Westerners point to the items with their feet, with their shoes. And for Asians, that's just unbelievable. So, and another thing, they use their, how we point at things using our index finger? Mm-hmm. Well, overall, Asians find that pretty rude and very sort of direct and obtrusive. And they tend to point using their thumb. So that's if you're pointing at a person, if you're pointing at an object, anytime you want to point at something, use your thumb. Don't point your feet at people. Don't touch people on the head. The Muslims, usually they eat directly with their hand, their right hand. So the right hand and the left hand. The left hand is used to clean themselves up when they use the toilet. They tend to not use toilet paper. And the right hand is used for eating. So whenever they eat, you'll see that they usually set their left hand down on their leg or on their chair, and then they just use their right hand to eat. But again, they don't expect Westerners to have to follow their own habits. So if you want to use a spoon and fork, then that's perfectly fine. And most, even little local restaurants have spoons and forks, so that's not a problem.
What was the best day you had in Java?
Maybe when I climbed up to the top of Mount Semeru, Java's highest volcano. And because I did it solo, I got to the top and I had already heard about how dangerous it could be. At the bottom of the mountain, before you start to climb up the actual cone of the volcano, which takes several hours, there's a sign there. There's all these little placards of this person died here on such and such a day. One died on that such and such a day. So I really stopped for a second and thought, wow, do I really want to climb this mountain alone here when there's this basically graveyard at the base of the mountain? So one of the main things is that people get lost because you hike up and they can't get back to their original place, or they're not prepared with the weather, and the weather can come in really quickly, or Mount Semeru decides to blow up some poisonous gases, and the wind changes, and the gases come on you, and so you die. So when I climbed up the mountain, I was very careful to just keep looking back at the way that I came so that I wouldn't get lost. It's just a big open cone anyhow. There aren't many landmarks, but just to sort of see the path I was on, and then get up, and also be very careful about if it was getting cloudy or the clouds were coming up. So I got up to the top, and I just had a few minutes before I started seeing some, smoke kind of maybe blowing my direction. So I pretty much just ran down the mountain to get back to where I was. So it was just a very great feeling to reach the peak of that mountain by myself on a 3-day trek and the elevation is 3,767 meters, which is about 11,000 feet, I think.
I was just up at 11,000 feet or 12,000 feet last weekend, and I didn't really feel like climbing a mountain. I got up there on a gondola, and a flight of stairs was breathtaking.
I thought you were saying you just climbed.
No.
I was going to say, yay! Let me check the calculation. Then, of course, the other day was, when I got to go to the Sultan's birthday party. That was pretty cool.
Okay, sure. Thinking of locals, I was going to ask you who's the most memorable local you met, other than the Sultan.
Yes.
Who would be the most memorable local that you met?
Well, he's not exactly local because he's from the island of Flores. But at one of the little guest houses I stayed at, there was a guy there by the name of Valentinos. He was from Flores Island. He was there working in this little guest house. And he was just a really nice guy. The people from Flores are Christian. And so they have these Christian names. And so I could tell immediately, not just by his name, but also his mannerisms and the way he looked and everything, that he was different from the Javanese. And I've met some other guys from Flores as well since then. And there's something just a little bit different about them. They're very nice. They try to be really helpful. They're very respectful. Maybe it's just more familiarity because we also grew up in Christian climate. I'm not sure. But we stayed in touch for a few years after that. One day he took me to a temple out in the countryside. And when we arrived, we had to get dressed up in the traditional clothing to enter the temple. So that was kind of fun.
And you talked about being familiar or more familiar. If you think of Java,
right?
When did you feel closest to home? This is very familiar. And then when did you feel furthest from home? This is nothing at all. We're not in Kansas anymore.
Oh, Chris, I don't know if I can answer that question because by the time I went to Java,
You've been on the road for so long. I wondered if that would be a hard one.
Yeah, I left the States in 1991 and I went to Java in 2001. So that was already 10 years living in Japan. Well, probably one was when I got to Bogor City because the population density was so incredible. Like I said, even after living in Japan for 6 years, which is pretty crowded, I got to Bogor and I thought, wow, this is what they mean about population density. And the second, we're not in Kansas anymore, moment would have been when I was hiking across the crater of Mount Bromo because it just is so desolate. It just looks like this moonscape. And I came across, this would be another memorable local guy. I came across this local guy carrying some sort of a crop. And this guy was super poor. I mean, his clothes were all beat up and his very dark skin, which probably is because he was working in the sun as a farmer. That was just a very interesting moment. The two of us from completely different cultures just meeting each other in this desolate place. If it's okay, I'll send you that picture in.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And familiar. Can't think of any.
All right.
Maybe I haven't been going out clubbing that much in the last few years, but I used to do a lot of clubbing. I'm not really much of a drinker or take any party favors, if you know what I mean, but I just love dancing. So I love to go out clubbing. And the clubs in Jakarta, that was the one thing about Jakarta that was really great. They have amazing city clubs. If you're into big dance clubs and just want to dance your butt off all night, there's some great clubs. So at that time in my life, when I was there and I went to these clubs in Jakarta, it was like, wow, this is great.
I've got 4 more questions. Before I get to them, is there anything else you would really want people to know before they go to Java?
Well, one place I forgot to talk about altogether is Bogor, and Bogor is a very cool little place, little city. Bogor is 60 kilometers south of Jakarta. It was an old hill station for the British, and British, whenever they were around Asia, they built these hill stations where it was a little cooler than the main center. And they also like to make botanical gardens. And so they built this amazing botanical garden in Bogor. And also Bogor is famous for having a lot of storms, very dramatic weather. And it's very hilly. So on the edge of the city, looking out over kind of like mountains and all these thunderstorms off in the distance, I saw some pretty amazing storms. Botanical gardens is cool. And near Bogor, there's another mountainous area. There's a wildlife safari where I saw white tigers. which was miraculous. And when you go up further into those mountains, there's tea plantations. So that would be another good place for people to base themselves for maybe a week, a few days a week, in Bogor, see the botanical gardens, go to the tea plantations, this safari. There's also good hiking in the mountains near there.
Okay. 4 last questions.
Yes.
You're standing at the prettiest spot in Java. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
Probably in the mountains near Bogor. As you go higher and higher up into the mountains, there's all these tea plantations. And the views, of course, whenever you go up in any mountains, the views that you get, the widespread panoramic views become more beautiful. And on the other side of that mountain, between there, that was Gunung Gede, and Bandung, the just incredible views of mountainous landscape with all these terraced rice fields stretching into the distance.
One thing that makes you laugh out loud and say only in Java.
When I was staying overnight in Solo, it happened to be the year that President Bush made some statement that really pissed off the Muslims. I was staying in a little guest house in Solo, and the next morning I got up and I checked my internet, and I had got this message, this urgent message from a German guy who I had met. Lash, are you still in Solo? You got to get out of there now. Hurry up. Wow, what's going on? So basically this militant group in Java had gone through the night before to every hotel in Solo and evacuated, gone through the records at the reception desk of every hotel in Solo, located any Americans that were staying in the hotels, gone and banged on their doors and told them, you got 24 hours to get out of our country, leave now. Well, they missed me because I was in this little tiny guest house. But basically there's huge warnings for the Americans to get out. And a local friend who I had met came by to see if I was okay and what I wanted to do. And I decided, I'll just stay and go mountain climbing. But anyhow, I thought, only in Java would this militant Muslim group come through and take it upon themselves to, kick all the Americans out of the country. But I suppose you don't want to put that in your report.
No, we'll leave that in. Okay, last 2 questions. Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Java when what?
When you can't believe how many hordes of people are surrounding you.
And if you had to summarize Java in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
3 words. Can they be 3 short phrases? Beautiful scenery? Could that be one?
Okay.
Spectacular temples. And stunning volcanoes.
Excellent. And Lash, where can people read more about your travels?
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I have my travel blog called lashworldtour.com. Basically, it's all about my wanderings around the earth. I give a lot of travel tips, a lot of narrative travel stories, photo galleries, and information on destinations.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler and telling us about your love for Java.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that. It's been great fun, and I'll look forward to hearing it when you broadcast it on Amateur Traveler.
In news of the community, I got an email this week from Sam, just up the road here in Hayward, California, who said, "Hi there, Chris. Been listening to the podcast for about a year or so, and I have listened to almost every episode. So I figured now might as well be the time to finally send you an email about just how awesome your show is. The Amateur Traveler is by far my favorite travel podcast. You and your guests manage to consistently deliver captivating anecdotes, stories, history, and culture in an informative yet entertaining way. I can't tell you how much a relief it has been for me to be able to listen to your show at work, as I may have one of the least stimulating jobs in existence. Yet every Monday morning I look forward to booting up iTunes to see what new photo pops up, to discover someplace new or to rediscover someplace known. I've always been interested in travel, but I credit your show with really ramping up that travel bug to near mania. In fact, thanks in part to the constant reminder of awaiting adventure that your podcast has been, my girlfriend and I have decided to take advantage of the working holiday visa and spend a year in New Zealand. We leave next April. We can't wait. Always keep up the good work. You've been an inspiration to me, and I look forward to what's in store for the future. Best to you and your family from right down the road." Sam, thanks so much. As I've mentioned in the show, I'm always really excited to hear that people have been inspired and are hitting the road. And that's good news. Sorry to hear about the soul-sucking job. I hope that gets better. This would be a good opportunity to say this show is coming out a little late, but I will still make your Monday deadline. With that, we're going to wrap up this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email, as Sam did, to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can also join the Facebook community, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. You may see a trend here, or follow me on Twitter at Chris2X, or at Amateur Traveler. If you happen to be in iTunes and can give us a 5-star review, it helps people find the show. And as always, thanks so much for listening.